Hey, good afternoon. It's Wednesday, October 23rd. I am that developer dad, or Rob, if you know me well. And I'm building a admin system for the DMs familiar. And what this admin system is going to do is it's going to take care of handling the things that need to happen within my systems whenever somebody signs up for a subscription, their subscription renews, they make some change to their uh, subscription account, stuff like that. Um, I could just have the payment processor email me whenever that happens, but I don't want to have to jump up out of bed at 3 in the morning on a Saturday after being out at the bar all night to do all of the account, all the back end system manipulations required. I'm probably going to do that manually for the first 10 or so people that I get signed up, but I'm going to target like 10 friends to be those first few users. So I don't mind managing it manually for 10 people, but when it gets to 20 or 30 or 100, that's going to start to be a real pain in the neck. So I'd best have something that kind of takes away my need to intervene in every single happening that goes on with the payment processor in my product. So this morning I screwed up. I did a streaming session this morning, but I never shared my screen and I never turned myself off mute. So I just threw that whole stream in the trash. But in that stream, I explained what a validation engine is. And I did some writing about, what it is from a normal person's point of view. And I did like this big long example and everything like that. And then I distilled it down to the nerd stuff where I started talking a bit more technically. And all of this writing doesn't belong here. It belongs in docs/concepts/ what are rules.md. Let's give it a header. Are rules in software? Every single thing that happens is because at some level, spell it right, Rob, a set of rules have executed and determined the next step to happen when running the code. Commit the changes. Yes. Let's take a look at it. All right. So I'm going to pop into component details, come down to validation engine, edit this, and I'm just going to go all the way to the bottom and cut that to my clipboard, commit, back to concepts, what are rules, edit, paste, scroll up the top, when running the code. The most obvious example of rules in software that is built with modern languages and frameworks is validation. and save. Back to our component details. Validation engine, edit. Normal person stuff. Boop, boop, boop. Purpose. Validation engine is a component used by the account manager to assess whether a customer's subscription is in a state that allows for the modification request that the manager is handling. Sometimes we might get a request to start a new subscription for a customer. For example, we have a business rule that states that each customer account may have 0 or exactly 1 subscriptions attached to it. There are a couple contexts in which validation can be done. One, ensure that ensure completeness and compliance with the data requirements for the requested process. We're going to boop that in. This simply means that all of the information that we need to complete the request is present and in a correct format so that the back-end system can do its work without running into any, I need this piece of data and it wasn't given to me. I need to panic now. Within this context, we are ensuring that all the fields that are necessary, all the required fields that are necessary for the process to execute have a value, and that each value is in the expected format. i.e. dates are presented as dates, numbers are presented as numbers, etc. Believe it or not, these things go sideways all the time. To ensure that the incoming data, once we've made sure that the incoming data looks right, we need to make sure that the existing state of whatever we're changing can accept the incoming change. Now, I want to preview this, make sure I've got my format right. I'm going to boop this in one, change it to a bullet point. For example, we have the incoming new subscription request identifies a customer who's already got one. Is very nice. Even though the information in the request is complete in the correct formats, that request cannot be processed against the identified customer's account. Now, this kind of scenario is likely going to be handled by the e-commerce service that I'm going to be engaging with. But I still need to do this check just in case I build this capability in to an external UI that I would have at my disposal, that kind of thing. So we can get rid of these examples. These types of checks are called validations, which are based on and formed from rules either. These rules can be defined by business policy or even technical requirements of the system itself. They're all manifestations of business rules, business policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some business rules, like if a customer hasn't got this data and this data and this data and this data in our storage system, then we don't consider them to be a customer. We consider them to be a lead, maybe. And so we can, when we're setting up the storage resource for that object, we can put technical constraints. We can manifest those policies as aspects of the storage technology itself, requiring values for certain properties, making certain fields disallow null values, things like that. Ultimately, all of those things you should be able to trace all of the decisions that you make when you're setting up your storage, your logic, your presentation. All of these decisions should be driven by what the business has specified in terms of what it needs. Now, we might have to put some other additional requirements around what the business needs based on the technology we're using, constraints that the technology imposes upon us, things like that. But all of these rules should ultimately find their origin in some kind of business policy document. I've worked with a lot of product managers and engineering managers that are like, oh, we don't need to document that. That's common sense, until somebody leaves it out. Somebody who is otherwise viewed as incredibly smart by by everybody around them, including those managers. But they're absolutely gobsmacked that this person didn't implement this little aspect of something because, well, why wouldn't they? It's common sense. And in my experience, when I think something should be common sense, I have to remind myself that is usually a false assumption. Because not everybody thinks about things the same way I do. Not everybody's had the lifetime of different contexts and experiences and ways of going about performing their tasks. So what I consider to be common sense for something might be a brand new way of considering that similar concept or that area for somebody else. And it's not to say that I'm smarter or they're not as smart or what have you. We just have different histories. So a lot of people like to skip over documentation. I even for like the little simple things. And yes, you can have like an oral tradition within a development organization or a business organization, but it's better and safer for everybody involved if these assumptions that people are making are documented and agreed upon in some repository. And documentation of, accepted practices, detailed wonky aspects of how a rule should be structured or executed or what have you, how it should be expressed. All of these things need to be kept in a curated repository. And this is a problem that's plagued business and software for as long as businesses and software have existed. Nobody likes doing documentation. It's expensive. The immediate value isn't easily apparent, but it can form a source of truth or a North Star for all of the company's efforts. And it becomes especially important when you're trying to commit or automate the day-to-day tasks of running the business, if you don't have a well-defined and clearly documented way that these things should happen and all of the little nuances, then you're going to have a heck of a time. You're going to waste an awful lot of time going back and forth between, the business leaders and the development department, arguing over how a thing should be done when, each of them have different definitions of common sense for that aspect. If it's agreed upon, documented, and codified somewhere that's accessible to both technical and non-technical people, you're going to have a much more productive organization. That's my opinion. Every business needs a librarian. Every business needs a team of scribes. Of course, the number of people that are those librarians and scribes varies based on the size of the business and the complexity. For me, I am the librarian, I am the scribe, and I am everything. But one day I might win a lottery and start hiring some people, and I'm going to want them to have this information that's in my head and not have to have a conversation about it. Not have to worry about them writing down every single statement I make, every nuance, all of those things, because they're not gonna. I wouldn't. So having these things fleshed out somewhere is incredibly valuable. It is unfortunately also relatively expensive, but in terms of business continuity, risk reduction, all kinds of fuzzy things that don't immediately go into a balance sheet or a general ledger or what have you. They're immensely important and immensely valuable, and unfortunately, they often fall victim to urgency. And I've got a couple of urgent things chewing at me, off on the sides of my brain here. So I want to get through this as quickly as possible. So, nerd stuff. Nerd stuff. A validation engine is a code artifact that has an organized collection of rules that can be applied to some entity in whichever combination is required by some process. This collection contains an indexer which identifies the system object, aka system object, some process, aka process activity step. Contains an indexer which identifies the combination of system object plus aka logical action. Yeah, I like business action. I don't like using business object system action. This collection contains an indexer which identifies the combination of system object plus index action and a set of rules that must be satisfied for that system action to proceed with using the supplied system object instance. Super abstract here. Each rule specifies a particular type of system object, identifies the property that the rule applies to, and an expression that must evaluate to true, and that means a Boolean expression that must evaluate to true. Optionally, a rule may also be configured with a consequence action that performs some manipulation against the system object instance when the expression returns false. An expression expects a test operand. An expression has a test operand, an operator, and an acceptable value operand. Let's preview this text, because that feels like a big honking wall of text because I didn't format it correctly. Let's add our markdown. First, we'll break it up into paragraphs. Preview. Flurp. Okay, that's better. Edit. Okay, a validation engine is a code artifact that has got Mrs. is out grocery shopping and is texting me even though she knows I'm trying to do this stuff. Has an organized collection of rules that could be applied to some entity, whichever combination is required by some process. This collection contains an indexer, which identifies the combination of system object plus system action, and a setup for each indexed combination. There is a set of rules that must be satisfied for that system action to proceed with. For that system action to proceed. Each rule has a type of system object to which the rule applies. A string that identifies the string value that identifies the property that the rule applies to. A Boolean expression that must evaluate to true. Optionally, a rule may also be configured with a consequence action that performs some manipulation against the system object instance, the type of system object to which the rule applies. An execute method that accepts an instance of the type specified in the applies to type rule property. This name ain't great. String value that identifies the property that the rule applies to. Inspect. Sure about this name either. You know what we're going to do? Property, 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 method. Execute a method that accepts an instance of the type specified in the type property. And returns a Boolean if the optional consequence action has been configured, the instance will be returned in an out parameter from the rule X from this method. Yeah. An expression has test operand, type specifier, that defines the type expected, the type used when comparing the inbound value to test against the acceptable value expected value a method that accepts a value of the appropriate type, compares it to the expected value operand using the specified operator, and returns a Boolean value representing the outcome of the expression evaluation. And that, at its simplest form, creates our object model for a validation engine. So I could do a diagram of it. As a matter of fact, I probably should. I'm going to save this. And I'm just going to add some text over the top. Burp. Add this here. Pull it all the way over here. And I want to bigify that to an 18. The text will be validation engine data model. All right, so a rule set delete that. Where's my UML goodness? Mockup buttons, web icons, web logos. Not what I wanted. More shapes. Where's UML? VMware cabinets, infographics, web icons. Blah, blah, blah. Cloud and Enterprise, UML. Here we go. Apply. Let's pop UML open. All right. So what's that? Object, interface, class. Interface. I'm going to change the name on this to I validator of T. Excuse me. We're going to bigify this. Bah. It's class name. Class name. Delete. Delete. What's this? Component. Component with attributes. Block. Module. Package. Object. All of these suck. This is what I want. These, I don't use fields in my interfaces. That's weird. I validation engine. Of T. Of T? Yeah. Load rules. Rule source. And target type. Void. Validate for target type instance and object, because I'm not quite sure what form this is going to take yet. Validation context. And it will return target type. Validated of target type. Yeah. So essentially we're going to use the decorator pattern, hey, C-films, on the target type. And all the validated of T is going to be is a excuse me, a wrapper around T, what we've validated, that carries a collection of validation messages. Now, as each rule in our validation engine executes against that target type instance, if it fails, it's not going to bounce out with an exception. It's going to just add a validation message to the list of validation problems on the instance that's being expected. And rather than alter the target type or require that all inbound target types conform to some contract or protocol, I'm just going to wrap an object around that instance that carries those validation messages back to the caller. And then the caller can inspect the validated object, say, is it valid? Yes, fantastic, off we go. If it's not valid, then it can create some sort of return contract with the validation messages in place that it sends back to the whoever called the manager. So validate for, and that's really it. Yeah. Now, our rule source that just returns, and I'm going to call this iRule source. I'm falling down the validation and rule engine rabbit hole here. I've always wanted to build one, and I need one now. So I want to see if I can build a generic one that I can use all over the damn place whenever I need it. That way I've only got to write it this time, and then later when I need it, I can just import it into whatever I'm building. So load rules. Rule source, target type. Yeah, okay. So now I need, where's this? Where did I get this one? Here it is. What's that? I'll use this. And I don't think I'm going to do this as an interface. Rule base. And I'm going to make it abstract. Class. Rule base. Field will be type. No. Virtual public. Abstract. Evaluate. Object instance. Returns a bool. Field is a list of expression rule expressions plus field func object false consequence. Yeah, I feel a little funny about that, but we'll get there. Rule base, and I'm going to copy this. Class rule of T function of T out object instance result. No, transformed instance. Is that what I want? Excuse me. Let me think. Thinking. No, I'm chasing my own tail here. I think the way to do this is to commit my changes, because I do this type of thinking better with a code editor in front of me. And I just noticed that it's 2 o'clock, and I've actually got some experimentation to do on some other aspects of the project. I've been C-Films. I'm sure you can relate to this. You're using MariaDB or MariaDB. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'm going to go with Maria because we're already perilously close to Mariah Carey season. And all she wants for Christmas is me, and I don't know what she's going to do with me when she gets me. I assume that she feasts on the flesh of her victims. So I've been doing some cost projection for my hosting and the stuff I'm using up in the cloud for the DMs familiar. And of course, I went to SQL Server as my first choice for storage. Now, and the fact that Microsoft offers a free tier for the Azure SQL database, that made it an even easier choice for me because I've been using SQL Server in various versions since 2001. So a long bloody time I've been using that tech, and it's become sort of my default. And I've been looking at what it would cost me to run an Azure SQL database, even just a single instance, serverless, but have it run 24/7, and that's going to be like $300 or $400 a month. And that's way more than I want to pay just to have the database responsive all the time. But I also don't want to make my end users have to deal with warm up times or what have you when it shuts itself off. So it was scratching my head going, how can I cut those costs down? Like, I suppose I could just crack open, like, initiate a blob storage account and just write JSON files for all of the stuff that I need to keep track of, and maybe organize it based off of user ID or whatever, like by folders or something. And that felt really dumb and cumbersome and ridiculous. And then I was like, oh, damn it, Rob. Azure Table Storage. So I'm thinking I might want to do an experiment with using Azure Table Storage for some things instead of the Azure SQL database, because I'm not using any of the relational capabilities of SQL. I'm not I'm not concerned about referential integrity or anything like that, because I'm managing all of that stuff in code. I don't need foreign keys. I don't need, a million bloody indexes or any of that stuff. I just need somewhere where I can write a row of structured information and then like get rid of that row of structured information or what have you. And it occurs to me that Azure table storage the might be a solid option for that. And then I looked at the pricing calculator, and 10 gigs is going to cost me like 50 cents a month. Now, if it works out that it's not that much of a lift to get my storage code bounced over from SQL Server to Azure Table Storage, and I discover that it's at least as performant as SQL Database, then it's a no-brainer. I'm gonna make that change. I also saw today that table storage, it's basically just an Azure storage account. I don't know if you've ever worked with Azure storage, but basically you can do like file storage, blob storage, which is binary large objects, but you can use blob storage for damn near anything. There's queue storage, which allows you to store messages and retrieve them in a first in, first out basis. It's not technically SQL. What you're doing is you're essentially storing tuples in table storage. Now, I haven't dug into all the ins and outs of it, but it's essentially a much cheaper, less feature rich. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't contain all of the relational stuff and all of the extra goo that you would get in a relational database management system. But it will allow me to store basically structured data in Azure very inexpensively. I don't know that it's necessarily NoSQL. I'll be doing some research after this stream, and maybe even doing like a little kick the tires sample project to see if it'll meet my needs. And if it does, I'm going to be refactoring my resource access components to use it instead of the SQL database. And if I can kick SQL database to the curb, that's going to potentially save me a ridiculous amount of money and give my users a better experience. So that'll be win-win if I determine that it's suitable for this particular use case. My gut tells me that it probably is. Like I'm feeling 90% sure. I just want to make sure that the other 10% either doesn't matter or is satisfied by the actual technology. So yeah, today I've been focusing in on defining and getting ready to build a validation engine, and validating my objects for completeness is one thing, but I also want to be able to validate these objects for appropriateness or against the existing state of whatever is being manipulated, and make sure that that the data that's coming in for the activity request, when it's applied to the existing state of the object, that state is still valid in terms of satisfying all of the business rules and stuff like that. And I've kind of broken it down so that, for an object that's being manipulated by a process, we've got a finite set of manipulations that can be performed against the object. No, I don't need a database for the login system because I'm using Microsoft Entra. Active Directory, basically. All of my users are getting a an entry in Active Directory. And that's what I'm using for both authentication and authorization, because I'm controlling access to the product features by membership in a user group or a security group. So yeah, that sidesteps that. It also means I don't have to worry about keeping people's passwords secure. Microsoft does that for me. So yeah, I don't need a database for any of that. I did look briefly at Azure Database for Postgres and Azure Database for MySQL. Active Directory, it's basically a big honkin', the version of it that I'm using. They've renamed it to Entra. Um, it's an identity store. It stores basically login identities, um, identities for different processes that might be running in your system, stuff like that, and groups those into security groups that you can use for controlling access to resources in your system. Um, yeah, it's got a pedigree of God. The idea is at least 25, 30 years old. But Microsoft just renamed Active Directory to Entra ID, and there's a business to business, and then there's a business to customer version, and I'm using the business to customer version. And it really just allows me to keep track of my users. It allows federation with Facebook, Google, Apple, all of those identity providers, so that I can do federated single sign-on or social login or whatever. And it hides all of that information from me unless I actively go looking for it. So yeah, I dig it. And it means I don't have to make sure that my software that I write is secure enough to protect those users' information. And in my cloud deployment, I don't even know what the passwords are for the various services, because I'm using Entra Managed Identity, which basically says, hey, Entra, for this app service, I want you to create an identity. Tell me its username, but don't tell me anything else. And that's what we're going to call this service when it's trying to when it's trying to access these other services that I have deployed in Azure. And then I go over to those other services and say, hey, let this identity is allowed to use you. And I don't see the passwords. I could go get them if I needed to, but I don't need to. So, and in addition to that, I've got Entra configured to rotate the passwords for all of these managed identities every N days. So even if an object's password does leak out, it automatically gets changed every so often. Or I can go in and say refresh the password on this service. So it's super nice. And it means I also don't have to store those system passwords anywhere. Because as soon as it's stored digitally, some bad guy might get access to it. But yeah, Active Directory is just a store of identity and permission structures and a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's what I'm using it for. You don't have to use that other stuff, and I'm not. I don't need it. So yeah, Azure Table Storage. I have some homework to do, and I need to go look at that. And there's a smaller, cheaper language model that's just been made available in my in the Azure region that I'm deploying to, that I want to experiment with and see if it does an equivalent job to the model that I'm currently using. Because if it is suitable, it's going to be a whole lot less expensive for me to run this product. So that's awesome, because it means I'll be able to support more users for what I'd originally budgeted and what I'd originally projected. So that's kind of awesome, and it makes me very happy. So I'm going to go do some homework, and tomorrow I'm going to I'll probably clone this repository down to my local system this afternoon or this evening. And tomorrow I'm going to start building out these rules and validation concepts into something repeatable and reusable. And if it works, I'm going to have to move that validation engine out, or the rules execution and schema and the validation engine concept itself out to a separate repository and turn it into a NuGet package or something. We'll see. This could be cool. So tomorrow we code. This afternoon I experiment. So thanks for popping in, C Films. It's always great to chat with you. Yeah, hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Have yourself a good night. Everybody else, happy coding.